Inside of your tables, every column will, of course, have a name. Well, sometimes that name isn't overly clear, that in a lot of databases, you'll wind up seeing names that have underscores, you'll wind up seeing names that are different abbreviations, that are different codes, that mean something to whoever it is that created the application, but aren't going to mean anything at all to, well, anybody else outside of that database. So if I'm creating a query that's going to be used inside of a report and I'm going to hand this to somebody else, I want to make sure that it's as clear as possible as to what each column contains, as to what the data actually is that's inside of them. Additionally, when I'm creating a query, I may do something to the columns that causes the name to go away. If I perform any calculation on a column, the column names are going to go away. This is where column aliases come into play. The way that we alias a column is by having the original column or expression, a space, the word as, a space, and then the name that we now want to utilize. So for example, if I come back over here and I wanted my product ID to just simply be ID, then what I can do is say as, and then ID, and now you'll notice when I execute this, that what I get back is just simply ID. Now it's also possible for me to put my square brackets around this, or even actually single quotes around that when I alias my names. Now, the square brackets and the single quotes will allow me to put in characters that typically aren't going to be allowed. I personally always use the single quotes, and the reason for that, at least for me, is I think it just makes it stand out a little bit more, that you'll notice that string literals in SQL automatically wind up as red text, and I think that just pops a little bit more, and especially if I'm doing some complex query, I think it makes it just a little bit easier to read. Again, completely optional, just one of those things that I like. Now, I mentioned calculations. So the question then becomes, all right, well, what calculations are available to us? Well, as it turns out, basically any normal math operation that you would expect. So I've got my multiplication, my division, my addition, my subtraction. Two little things. Number one, the plus operator is also going to be used for string concatenation. The second thing is modulo. What modulo will do is perform division and give us the remainder. So if you remember back to when you were learning division for the first time, and don't worry, I'm not going to make you confess how long ago that was, mostly just because I don't want to have to admit it. What you did was you had your little division and you came up with the answer and you put your little R and then you put whatever the remainder happened to be. Modulo will give us that remainder. This is very useful for figuring out maybe divisibility, figuring out every X number of rows, things like that. Let's take a look at how we can do this. So if we come back to the Management Studio, let's change the way that we're going to get our last name and our first name by just putting in a plus sign, or I'm sorry, a space in between. So you'll notice that it's going to be plus, my space, and then my plus. So now let me execute that. And what you're going to notice is that sure enough, we are getting everything with first name, space, last name. But you're also going to notice that it's now going to say no column name. Again, the alias is going to come into play because otherwise, when I try to use this later on in my report, it's not going to be able to refer to that. So I need my alias. So what I can do is I could say as full name, and now when I execute that, now you're going to notice that column is now called full name. And that's how we can use our select statements and connect up to our server.